Hello and welcome to today's lecture on Washington and World War One. In today's lecture, we'll be talking about the impact of World War One upon the state of Washington. In short, World War One is going to impact every single state in the United States. It is the largest conflict in world history to this point. World War Two is a much bigger conflict, but remember, no one knows World War Two is going to occur at the time of World War One. In its own time, World War One was known as the Great War, the war to end all wars, because the size of the conflict had just never been seen before in world history. Never been seen before in world history. So, inevitably, every state in the Union is going to feel the impact of the war because when the United States enters the war in 1917, it's going to implement a draft, it's going to ask for volunteers, and every state is going to provide a certain number of soldiers, including Washington. So, in that sense, excuse me, you're going to have Washington feeling the impact of the war like every other state. However, another way that states often felt the impact of the war was economic and demographic, or the people themselves. And what I mean by that is some states had economic industries that were needed for World War One. And as a consequence, they feel the impact even more through mobilization. As you will see, Washington is one of those states. So Washington is one of those states. So economically, Washington will feel the impact of the war. But the second thing is any state that had a large immigrant community would feel the strain and tensions of the war in certain ways. And the reason for that is that the majority of immigrants to America came from Europe. World War One is fought primarily in Europe. There are other theaters of war, but the main theater is in Europe. And what happened is that many of the immigrants to the United States came from parts of Europe that were impacted directly or participated in World War One. And therefore, many of these immigrant communities had families who were still, or family members or relatives that were still back in war torn countries. And that ended up impacting them. But also, as if immigrant life wasn't tough enough in the United States, and as we've documented, it is very difficult, there's lots of prejudice. Once the United States enters the war, many immigrants find themselves as having come from countries or regions of Europe that the United States is now at war with. And they find the discrimination against them even greater by virtue of where they immigrated from or their family's geographic and ethnic heritage. We're not going to talk a ton about that in this class, but it is something to keep in mind. All right, let's begin our exploration. So what we need to do right now is overview World War One. I'm not going to go through a comprehensive timeline of the war itself and the causes and the consequences and the conduct of the war. You can take a U.S. history class that covers World War One or a World or Western Civs class that covers World War One to have a more detailed account. And we have both of those at this institution, so you can, if you're interested, you can reach out to me and I'll direct you to the proper courses to take for a larger look at this. That said, we have to be aware of the big picture of the war. So the war begins in Europe in 1914. The war involves basically two groups. One group that we collectively call the Allies, because the United States eventually allied with them. That is Great Britain and France. And then at the start of the war, Russia. So that was one block, one side of the war. That side, the Allies, fought against a group known as the Central Powers. The Central Powers were the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So Germany and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. The Austro-Hungarian Empire was basically what is now modern-day Austria, Hungary, combined with large chunks of Eastern and Southeastern Europe. So that was the two combatants. They were fighting one another on what was known as the Western Front, which was was in Belgium and northern France. And then there was an Eastern Front, which was a lot less defined in terms of its geography. So that's the basic sides of World War One. Now, before we get into what's the rest of what's on this slide, I just want to talk to you a little bit about what all this means, okay? At the time World War One breaks out, the United States has rapidly industrialized, and they have joined Great Britain and Germany as the most industrial economies in the world. So there's three large industrial economies in the world at the time World War One breaks out: Great Britain, Germany, the United States. The reason that this is very important for you to understand is that World War One is an industrial war. It's the first war in world history in which industrial powers are taking the economic might and technological superiority of industrialization and using that against one another. For the last century or more, Europeans have been taking their industrial might, their industrial supremacy, and all the technological and military advantages that industrial supremacy gave you, and they've been using it to do wars of conquest, aggression, imperialism, and colonialism, largely in Africa and Asia. So they had been fighting from a military perspective lopsided, unfair fights. They had superior technology and weapons that just were not possessed by peoples in Africa and Asia because of industrialization. But in World War One, what you have is all the weapons and mechanization of industrialization at war with one another. So both sides have machine guns. Both sides have heavy artillery. Both sides have modern steel-hulled ships and navies. Both sides have all of the technological capacity and the production capacity that the other side has. And that creates a horrific war experience, the likes of which the world had never seen before. But what it means in terms of just pure military tactics and strategy is that having adequate supplies to fight the war is going to mean a lot. And by adequate supplies, I mean adequate industrial material, having the weapons, the ammunition, the steel, the ships, the machines that you need to fight the war, having the food that you need to fight the war, having the clothing and medical supplies you need to fight the war. And keep in mind, all of these things, even food at this point, are being mechanized and mass produced because of industrialization. Britain, as the industrial giant of the Allies, is not only having to supply itself, it's having to supply its allies. Germany, as the industrial juggernaut of the Central Powers, also has to supply its allies. What happens is by 1915, it's very clear to Britain and Germany that they lack the economic capacity long term to keep mobilizing their economies totally for war and supplying themselves and their allies. It's just not possible for them to keep doing that. They're going to need another source for all of these modern economic goods to keep fighting the war. The only other source for that would be the United States. The United States is the only other country that could supply that stuff. This proves to be an economic boom to the United States because the United States declares neutrality in this conflict. The United States said, we're not going to pick a side, but we would be happy to sell to both sides. So the United States decides to be neutral, and they're going to sell to Britain and its allies and Germany and its allies. They're going to sell to both sides. From an economic and trade perspective, you might see why the US would do that. You have two different groups, both with huge demands for your industrial capacity, and that's just financially beneficial to your business. So the United States looks at this as an economic opportunity. Now, keep in mind, there is a moral question here, which is this economic opportunity is created by the industrialized death of soldiers unseen in world history. This is a war the United States businesses are profiting off of, and the United States' economy is profiting off of by being neutral. So when you read a lot about World War I and you study it, you'll see a lot of speeches by politicians and all sorts of individuals who are giving these high-minded speeches about America's principles and being neutral in this conflict and not being dragged in, and they'll give all sorts of justifications and moralizing for it. And I'm not suggesting that many of those people making those statements didn't believe that. What I'm saying is that underneath what many politicians and leaders would say it was a principled decision lies an economic reality in which the United States is benefiting tremendously from the need generated by the war on both sides. Now, Britain and Germany have no interest in American goods reaching their enemies. And so they're going to try and prevent that, first diplomatically by the United States picking a side, trying to force the United States to pick a side, and then later through military means. Britain does this through a blockade. Britain has the largest navy in the world at the time, and they just blockade Europe. American ships bound for Germany get redirected to Britain. So Britain is going to prevent all goods from getting to Germany, thus securing American goods for themselves and denying them to Germany. Germany can't afford to let that happen because that would give Britain a huge industrial and economic and material advantage in fighting this conflict. So Germany develops the U-boat, the first successful, useful submarines, and they begin to sink ships, American ships, on the Atlantic, saying, well, if we can't have these goods, Britain can't either. And so this then means that American neutrality is really not tenable. At first, anger was directed at Britain because of the blockade, but later, because of the unrestricted submarine warfare engaged in by Germany, that then tips the scales towards anger to Germany. There's other things going on here as well, but as I said, that's for another class. And so by 1916, because of the unrestricted submarine warfare, and then also because of some other events, most famously what's called the Zimmermann Telegram, which Germany tried to get Mexico to make war on the United States to distract the United States and keep it from potentially entering the war and siding with Great Britain. But due to the submarine warfare and a whole set of other facts, what begins to happen is it's clear the United States is going to enter the war, and increasingly there's an anti-German, anti-Eastern European sentiment that happens in the United States, and it's all part of this mobilization towards war, which ultimately comes in April 1917, which is when the United States declares war on Germany. But the troops aren't going to arrive until the fall of 1917 because the United States doesn't have a large standing army. This is something that we'll talk about later in this class, but the history of the United States up until World War II was a general distrust of large militaries. And so the United States would build up militaries to fight conflicts and then just scale them down. Most famously, they did this after the Civil War. The United States has one of the great armies of the world after the Civil War, and then once the war's over, they basically reduce down to a small force and let most of those soldiers go home. So there's not a large enough standing army to fight in the war in Europe when the United States declares war. So they have to mobilize and train troops. That takes a few months. So just briefly, right, I've already alluded to some of these points. When the United States enters the war, it has to mobilize because World War I is what we call total war. And what that means is that there is the battlefront and the home front. The battlefront is where the troops are going. It's where the military fights. But the home front is the society that supports the war effort. In total war, the economy and society are mobilized to support the war effort, which then blurs the line between civilian and military spheres of any given country. Okay? And so what happens is the United States begins to mobilize to fight the war. And that means taking the economy and transitioning it from producing goods for consumers in the United States and around the world and transitioning it to producing war goods. So factories that made, things out of metal are repurposed to make rifles, machine guns, and ammunition. Shipbuilding sites that build ships for hauling goods overseas are then repurposed to build naval ships. Clothing factories that made clothing for everyday use are then uh, transitioned to producing uniforms and armor and all the kinds of things that you would need for fighting a war. Food factory, food processing facilities that were producing food for the consumer market are then mobilized to produce for soldiers and allies abroad, and so on and so forth. And what that means is the economy is mobilized in a way that changes what your average person can get a hold of. And as a consequence, that means the people who aren't drafted to go in the war still feel its impact. What does that impact look like? Well, you have rationing of food, rationing of fuel, like oil, like gas and coal, rationing of clothing, rationing of all sorts of goods. And by rationing, it means only so much of it is produced for the consumer market, and consumers can only get so much of it. And when it came to basic necessities, they developed ration books, where you had a book that with these coupons, and the coupon entitled you to buy something, but if you didn't have a coupon, you couldn't buy it. And these are famously associated with World War II, but they actually first appear during World War I, right? There's also war bonds, where to fund the war, America sells bonds to the public, and the public is encouraged to buy them as their patriotic duty. You also get this sophisticated advertising campaign, which is designed to inspire patriotism, to inspire service, to inspire sacrifice, but also to vilify the enemy, in this case, the German Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And the way in which they do it is incredibly degrading, insulting, and drawing on racist and anti-Semitic tropes. And so you have a draft, you have rationing, you have all these kinds of things. It's total war. Everyone, as a part of society and the economy, is mobilized for the war effort. And so when the United States enters the war, enthusiasm is actually pretty high across the country once the decision is made. And as I mentioned earlier, right, the war had already been a boon for the U.S. economy, so it's just going to get even better now that, economically speaking, now that the United States has entered the war. And in particular, Washington's economic industries benefited from the war, right? Because Washington timber, mining products, agriculture, and shipbuilding industries all saw enormous growth and high profit as a consequence of the war itself. Also, World War I coincides with the development of airplane technology. And airplanes weren't a large part of World War I. Airplanes at this time are largely made of wood and fabric. So they in their engine, so the combination of the materials and the engines weren't powerful enough to carry like a payload. So they were largely used for scouting, or for spying activity, or target. You could drop a grenade, or you could fire a gun on a small outpost. So it had minimal application, but it was still useful. And the United States decided it needed to develop its own airplane industry. And out of this came William Boeing in 1916, founding a company that will later be called the Boeing Aircraft Company. So this has an enormous impact on the state of Washington. However, with the impact of the war came two really important events that will have a tremendous impact on the state of Washington, both during the war and outside of the war. If you recall, the United States was a state, Washington was a state that was really participatory in the progressive movement sweeping across the United States. So we had the progressive reform movement. And in the previous lecture, we talked about the reforms sweeping the nation and Washington-specific reforms. But the reality is, Washington has a strong progressive reform movement. As part of that, and in addition to that, Washington has a strong presence of organized labor. And if you recall, during this era, organized labor is fighting against the exploitation of workers by business owners, the terrible, dangerous working conditions, the low pay, the long hours, child labor, and so on and so forth. So there are labor battles happening in the state of Washington, and labor is one of the major voices in the progressive reform movement. Well, all those ideas are going to come to a head as a consequence of the United States' involvement in World War One and the economic consequences of entering the war. Okay? And the first event we're going to talk about, in which we can see organized labor coming up against the reality of the war effort and the reality of the war, is in November of 1916. So on the cusp of the United States entering the war, but Washington's economy is already benefiting from A, the expectation that the U.S. will enter the war, and B, the fact that they have been producing goods for sale to Europe because of the war. Okay, so one of the things that we have here is that the war is looming over things, and the war itself is going to turn the tide against the progressive movement. It's going to take the wind out of that sails. If you notice on the previous lecture when we talked about the progressive reforms, most of them were in 1913 and 14 and 15. And by the time you get to 16, 17, and 18, there are very few of them. And the reason for that is World War I. World War I just consumes all the political attention. And so the war itself is going to cause enormous strains in Washington. And the first event in which we see that is something known as the Everett Massacre. Okay? So as I mentioned, the war was a big boon for businesses producing goods that were desirable for the war effort. And timber was one of those products that benefited enormously from the war. And so logging companies and timber mills were making enormous profits. Workers looked at this and said, we're not getting our fair share. So what happens is that unions decide that they're going to attempt to do something about this. They're going to try and get a bigger share of these profits, what they consider a fair share of these profits. So what happens is unions associated with the IWW and the AFL organize a series of strikes at lumber mills all across the state of Washington, which means mostly the Puget Sound area. So they organize these strikes all across the Puget Sound, right? And these strikes are meant to basically target the mill owners. They say, look, if you want to keep making profits, you need these workers to produce these goods. Come to terms. By November, all the mill owners have come to terms with the unions and agreed to better conditions, right? They've negotiated with the union so that work can continue. However, there's one mill in Everett that held out. Its owner was fiercely anti-union, and he absolutely refused to negotiate with the union and tried hard to hire replacement workers. And it was getting very, very, the strain was real, the tensions were real, violence was a possibility. And so this one mill held out. The IWW decided to make an example of this mill because they didn't want to let one mill owner get away without negotiating with workers. So they were going to make an example of this mill owner. And so what the IWW does is that they're going to try and focus all of the attention on this one mill who has not resolved its striking worker situation. However, the mill owner has the alliance of the local and county police. So they've been using Snohomish County Sheriff deputies to break up strikes, to beat and club workers. And so they have the alliance of local politicians. That angers the IWW, and the IWW says, okay, look, this mill owner is not negotiating with those strikers, and they're using local law enforcement to break up strikes and to beat union workers. We're not going to let this stand. So the IWW decides that they are going to support this strike, and that just leads to even further clashes with strike breakers, mill employees, striking workers, and the local police. The Snohomish County Sheriff's Department decides that they've had that they're going to escalate this even further in their support of the mill. They order the IWW to leave Snohomish County. They basically say you can't be here. Now, it is true that at this point in American history, there is no right to strike, there is no right to unionize. Okay, that's true. That doesn't exist legally. But we do have something called the First Amendment, and most people associate the First Amendment with freedom of speech. But what most people don't realize is that within the First Amendment, there are 5 rights granted in the First Amendment. Speech is one of them, but it's not the only one. One of the rights granted under the First Amendment is freedom to assemble, that we are allowed to congregate into groups. So the Snohomish County Sheriff's Department basically kicking the union out. It's not clear whether legally and constitutionally they would even have the right to do that, because that would be A, policing someone's speech, in this case pro-union speech, and B, denying them their right to assemble. So it's not real clear there's a constitutional, that this is constitutionally allowed, but they do it anyways. The IWW cannot let this stand. They cannot let this stand, because if this happens, then this is a tactic that will be used all over the state and all over the country. That, hey, you just make an alliance with the local sheriff's department or local government or county government, and they can ban and eject unions, and then you can't work in that area, and the mill owners can do whatever they want. They simply, from a tactical perspective, cannot let that happen. So the IWW announces that they are going to return to Snohomish County. And on they say it's going to happen on November 5th, that they're going to arrive by boat. They're going to arrive by boat. And they're going to return to Snohomish County. They're going to board a boat in Seattle, take it to Everett, and then get off. It's a symbolic thing that you can't kick us out. But what happens is that the local press, which had sided with the mill owner, raises a fury, says that these socialist communist IWW members are coming to overthrow the local government and seize control of cities and county government and the police department. They raise a conspiracy furor. And the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office believes that they're going to be outgunned and outmanned. So they begin going around to local residents and deputizing them and giving them weapons and saying, here you go, come fight the IWW with us. And so what happens on November 5th, when the IWW arrives and begins to get off the boat, they're met by a mob that consists of the sheriff's department and these people that the sheriff's department has deputized. There's at least 200 people with weapons there, even more without. And this 200 people with weapons, as I said, are sanctioned by local law enforcement. And they refuse to let the IWW get off the boat. Now, there are members of the IWW who are armed as well. Tensions erupt and shots are fired. Ultimately, 7 people die. 2 local residents and 5 IWW members. Now, the sheriff's department, following the ceasing of the firing, arrests 75 IWW members and holds them for murder, charges them with murder. Now, these men were all later acquitted because there was just no evidence. But it's an example of growing tension created by the war and the way in which the war is changing progressive sensibilities. Washington was a fairly labor-friendly state. It wasn't, I wouldn't describe it as a pro-labor state, but it's about as friendly a state to labor as you'll find in the country. And even here, the war has created a situation by which people have turned on labor. It's a sign that the momentum of the progressive era is really not there anymore because of the economic and global situation created by the war. We next see this same sentiment in 1917 after the United States has entered the war, okay? So once the United States enters the war, many unions, most unions across the country decide that it's their patriotic duty to support the war and support the industries that underlie the war. And as a consequence, they agree for the time being to stop striking activity. However, notably, the IWW and unions associated with the IWW refuse to do so. They see the war as just capitalistic profit making. And as a consequence, they see nothing wrong with striking for workers to get a better deal, to get better conditions, better wages, better pay. So the IWW is not going, and its affiliated unions are not going to abide by this. And we see this in Washington with something known as the Spruce Division. So timber was one of the massively important war industries. And the United States considered timber to be a vital industry for maintaining the war effort. Okay? So, as a consequence of this, shortly after the United States declared war, the IWW declared a strike in the logging industry across Washington. So workers affiliated with the IWW went on strike. This really devastated and debilitated the logging industry. Without those workers, they couldn't get any logging done. Okay? The IWW workers just wanted better pay. They wanted an 8-hour workday. They wanted better working conditions. They wanted actual benefits in case they got hurt on the job. Their demands weren't unreasonable. But this was war, and the business owners appealed to the United States government. And they painted the union as being unreasonable and radical and a harm to the U.S. war effort. The president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, who traditionally was fairly favorable to unions and the organized labor movement, agreed. And to break up the strike, he sent U.S. Army soldiers to log on behalf of the logging companies. This group of soldiers were known as the Spruce Division because they were a division of soldiers who harvested trees, especially spruce. Now, I just want you to think about this. 27,000 troops are sent in to work for a logging company. These are soldiers who either volunteered or drafted to go to war, and they're being sent to work for logging companies so that logging companies don't have to agree to terms with the union. It's pretty astonishing and remarkable. And so this, and by the way, the IWW was pilloried in the press. The local press said that they were traitors, they were treasonous, they were unpatriotic, so the press was against them. Now, these 27,000 soldiers working to log was not a long-term solution. It was a temporary solution to keep it going. Eventually, the logging companies had to come to terms with the IWW and its affiliated workers. And the IWW got basically what they wanted. They got the most of what they want, of what I listed there as their demands. They got it. But ultimately, they lost the public relations campaign. They lost the PR war. And it was a sign of a growing anti-labor movement in Washington. It was a sign of how much ground the key players in the progressive movement were losing. And so it's an important moment. Now, we need to turn our attention to after the war. Because the war, the military phase of the war is concluded on November 11th, 1918. Today, we celebrate that as Veterans Day in the U.S., but everywhere else in the Western world, it's called Armistice Day. celebrating the cessation of the military phase of World War One. Now, there's not going to be an actual peace that ends the war until June of 1919, but there is no more fighting. The military phase is done as of November 1918. As a consequence, some of the mobilization of the economy can lessen. And there's a general sense that maybe society and economy can return to pre-war terms. And as a consequence of that, right, you get unions who, most of whom did what they perceived to be their patriotic duty and did not strike and worked in these industries during the war. And in doing so, helped make enormous profits for the business and industry owners. Now they want their fair share. And so what you see happen across the United States is unions begin to go on strike and begin to start organizing to get some of the benefits that they have, simply not seen since the war began. And one of the largest of these union movements that occurred in the country happened in Seattle. And so what happens in Seattle is that a lot of unions get together in February of 1919. So this happens, in February of 1919. And so what happens is they decide that we're going to have what's called a general strike. And a general strike was a tool that you saw happen in Europe frequently during the 19th and into the 20th century, but wasn't as common in the United States. And what a general strike was is when all the unions and all the different industries said, hey, we're just going to go on strike for a day, a week, or longer, just to demonstrate how vital workers are to society and the economy, how everything grinds to a halt without us. And it's an indication to political and business leaders that they need to take seriously the demands of the workers, because if you don't, the economy comes crashing to a halt. So a general strike is usually aimed at public relations and public perception. It's usually a PR stunt to indicate, hey, we're here, we're powerful, take negotiating with us seriously, right? It's generally done for tactical reasons, more broadly speaking, and to convey to the public the essential plight of workers, but also the essential nature of the workers. So what you have is the unions in Seattle calling for a general strike on February 6th, 1919, okay? And what they've said is we're all going to go on strike. Now, the unions have said that there are going to be some restrictions, right? So the workers who are going to go on strike are going to be like dock workers, mill workers, factory workers, city workers, etc. Right? Now, they're not going to stop the delivery of like food. They don't want people to starve or go without basic necessities. So anything related to basic services or food or whatever, the unions say we're going to let those workers go to work, but everything else is going to grind to a halt to demonstrate our power. That was the tactic they were going to use. And they made it well known, well in advance. The problem, though, for the workers is World War I has resulted in widespread disillusionment and disenchantment with reform and organized labor and all these kinds of things that happened before the war. We'll talk about that in the next lecture more deeply, but it's just something you need to be aware of. Second thing that's occurred is that there has been a major revolution in the world that has resulted in the world's first communist regime. And that is the Russian Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia that occurred in 1917, that resulted in the creation of the Soviet Union, the world's first communist country. And the nature of that revolution and the way in which it occurred and the civil war that is happening in Russia in 1919 as a consequence of that revolution, that has caused widespread fear of communism and socialism in the Western world, especially in the United States. And you often, if you read primary source documents at the time, you'll hear it referred to as Bolshevism after the Bolshevik Revolution, which the Bolsheviks the Bolshevik is just a term for the name of the Communist Party in Russia, which seized control of government and ultimately creates the Soviet Union and wins the Civil War. And so you'll see the term Bolshevik being used instead of communist, but they're essentially interchangeable. So there's this widespread fear of communism and socialism, collectively called Bolshevism, in popular culture and in the press. This widespread fear exists across the United States as a consequence of this. This is known as the Red Scare. It's the first Red Scare in American history. We'll talk more about that in the next lecture as well. But this Red Scare, right, informs how people are now perceiving many unions, particularly unions affiliated with the IWW, and many socialists and communists and leftist leaders in the country. And so what happens is the mayor of Seattle and many state politicians begin to paint the union's general strike is the first step in a communist revolution. That they're going to attempt to overthrow the government of Seattle and the government of the state of Washington and create a Washington Soviet, if you will. Now, this is complete nonsense. It was not any part of the plan of the union activists, even though there were some real radicals in this group that would have liked to have seen a socialist communist system. That's without question. But the Seattle General Strike was not the first stage in some sort of like worker uprising to seize local government and state government. But the propaganda was effective. It's how the press was painting this. And so when the strike occurs, it is a complete disaster from a public relations standpoint. And that disaster demonstrates how the zeitgeist and spirit of the country has changed and how we're going to see a cessation of the kind of spirit that we had seen leading into, right, the progressive era. The last event that we want to talk about that's part of this trend of the way in which the progressive movement has been halted and the tensions between organized labor and local government, local police, business owners, and the like, is something called the Centralia Massacre. Okay, something called the Centralia Massacre. It takes place in Centralia, Washington, which was a logging town, and as a logging town, that meant it had a healthy union president, and it had a healthy presence of the IWW. And so the Centralia Massacre takes place on November 11th, 1919. The Centralia Massacre takes place against the backdrop of the Red Scare and fears of communism and socialism and the tensions between workers and non-union members, okay? And so what happens on November 11th, 1919, there was a parade to celebrate the one-year anniversary of the ceasefire in World War I. And the parade involved veterans and local business groups and so on and so forth, okay? And during this parade, what happened is the parade route goes by the IWW building in Centralia. The members of the parade, particularly veterans groups, decide to stop. Instead of just walking by as part of the parade, the IWW building, they decide to stop in front of it and begin to make accusations of treason, yell slurs, yell insults at union members who are in the hall. Union members retaliate, right, by doing the same things. And eventually, right, tensions mount to such a point that there's gunfire, right? It's not clear who fired first, but what we know is that in the gunfire, 4 veterans who were outside on the parade route are killed. The remaining veterans then storm the building and the union members are forced to flee. However, one union member, pictured here, named Wesley Everest, was still in the building and was taken. He was then basically snatched and thrown in the local jail. And the local sheriff charged him with murder. It's not clear whether he actually fired any shots during this intense hostility that emerged during this parade. It's not clear what happened, and we'll actually never know what truly happened, because even though he was charged with murder before there could be fact finding and a trial, a local mob stormed the sheriff's department. The sheriff's department decided to let the mob have Wesley Everest. He was then taken and um, um, basically executed without trial by the mob, vigilante justice. And the tragedy is, in addition to the fact that we'll never know whether he fired any shots or anything, he never got a trial. We'll never know if he was guilty or not. But even if he had fired a shot, remember, it was the veterans who stopped in front of the IWW hall and escalated the situation. That doesn't excuse the violence, but we don't know who fired shots first. All we know is that shots were fired. Regardless, the whole truth will never fully be known, because the only person ever arrested was executed, via vigilante justice. But in addition to that being a tragedy on its own, Wesley Everest was not just a Union member. He was a World War I veteran himself. You can see him here in his service uniform. It's an indication of the kind of tensions ripping apart the country, and the complete reversal of fortune that the organized labor movement sees itself in, and progressive movements as a whole see themselves in, as we enter the 1920s. All right, I thank you for listening. I'll talk to you again soon. Bye for now.